Yeah, thank you for the question. I think Anna is quite right. With COVID-19, the gap between developing countries is widening. According to the IMF, in 2020, the average real GDP decline was larger in developed countries than in developing countries. But this year, our global economy is expected to grow by little less than 6%, but only for 3% for low-income developing countries. So, which means the developed countries are recovering faster while developing countries are lagging behind. So also many emerging and developing countries were already constrained with the limited fiscal space or with the external debts before the pandemic. So therefore, these governments have been less capable to provide their people with the vaccines or the extending the emergency fiscal measures for the industry or to enhance the social protection or transforming their education system online. So therefore, although the global economy continues to recover, the disparities caused by the pandemic are likely to remain longer. And also we have to pay due attention to the widening disparity within the people, among the people in one country. In a crisis like pandemic, the vulnerable groups such as women are hit even harder in all places around the world. For instance, the impact of employment and income is more likely to affect women and girls who are more likely to engage in lower income, low wage jobs. Lockdowns, job loss, sudden income shortfall have led to an increase in the harassment or domestic violence and the like. So we in JICA issued a guidance note for COVID-19 responses with gender lens last year so that we can respond to the unique risks faced by the women and girls in promoting COVID-19 responses. So my message that we should pay due attention on both in-country and between country disparities. Thank you.
Yes, COVID-19 is certainly widening the gap between rich and poor countries for two reasons. The first is simply that rich countries were basically able to tear up the fiscal rulebook and spend as much as they wanted on pandemic response, whereas low-income countries just didn't have that luxury. So high-income countries spent almost $700 per capita on social protection, whereas low-income countries spent just $4. So that's just one reason why it's so urgent to get these countries more emergency liquidity. And right now we're actually only halfway to the target of mobilizing $100 billion in special drawing rights to LMICs. The second reason why the pandemic is really causing inequality to skyrocket is in some ways very similar to the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Trillions of dollars of quantitative easing were basically pumped into financial markets. And what happens when you artificially boost growth with debt is you basically put workers on a treadmill that's getting faster and faster and faster. And the problem is that the value of their labor doesn't increase at the same rate of growth. So they can't keep up with rising prices. And it's this disconnect between growth and wages and productivity that leaves workers unable to deal with inflation, which is where we are now. So the winners are the wealthiest, whose asset prices are boosted through stock market booms, etc. And those gains are largely exempt from income or corporate tax. And so the result is you see the 10 richest men in the world, see their wealth double, whereas 160 million people are pushed into poverty.
Yes, I think equal access to vaccine is a global common priority. The government of Japan joins the COVAX facility, a global pact for joint investment and procurement for COVID-19 vaccines, along with more than 180 countries and regions to promote vaccination in developing countries. But vaccine access is not just about amount of investment. Delivery and logistics are also crucial. And my agency, JICA, contributes the part of the Japanese government efforts in establishing the cold supply chain to ensure the vaccines actually reach out to the people in developing countries. And also, it is important to enhance global vaccine production capacities. So we have an experience in supporting developing countries, the manufacturing of their own vaccines, not in the COVID-19, but for instance, in Vietnam, we have a measles and rubella combined vaccine production project. And they are currently making efforts towards their national vaccine production. So this kind of capacity building takes time, but definitely increase the resilience for the future. And talking about the resilience for the future, way forward, we are focusing on the strengthening the health resilience with wider scope than vaccine. And we are working to strengthen, namely the health systems and health crisis management systems, so to achieve the universal health coverage. We have launched the initiative called the JICA Global Initiative for Health and Medicine, launched last July, and it's an integrated approach covering prevention, precaution, and the treatment in order to protect people's lives and health. So far, we have supported or enhanced our support to 146 hospitals and 50 public health institutes worldwide. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
There's no question that unequal access to vaccines is making the pandemic not only more deadly, but also longer than it has to be. Right now, only about 5% of low-income countries are vaccinated, and that not only increases unnecessary deaths, it makes us more susceptible to new mutations that can evade our existing treatments and vaccines. But I think the vaccine issue is so important because it almost perfectly crystallizes how political choices and regulatory frameworks and special interests almost systemically push lower income countries, especially African countries, to the back of the line and dependent on donor recipient relationships. Rich countries, they didn't just buy billions more vaccines than they actually needed. They're also blocking a very important waiver of intellectual property at the WTO that would help expand production of vaccines and treatments. So what we need right now, I think, from rich countries to set the record straight is three things. They need to share these extra doses as quickly as possible before they're about to expire and actually publish the delivery schedules. Two, they need to fund these WHO-backed initiatives for global vaccine access. And three, they need to stop blocking the TRIPS waiver for IP and start making as many treatments and vaccines as possible in as many places as possible.
Yes, global coordination and cooperation is indispensable to defeat pandemic by accelerating the vaccine access worldwide as well as supporting financially or technically constrained countries. As for the vaccine, it is encouraging to see the effort like COVAX, a strong message and collaborative efforts that are agreed by G7 countries and the G20 countries. However, we still see a lot of gaps and spaces to be filled. So simply speaking, we all need to do more. And the global coordination and the cooperation is needed not only for the responses to the COVID-19, but also for better preparedness for next pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic. And as for the recovery, we development agencies are collectively aiming at not simply returning to the pre-COVID-19 condition, rather building back better to a more carbon neutral and resilient economy and society. And the global climate is a typical global public goods as greenhouse gas emission is in one country may affect other countries. And the international community has to come up with the better or transformative ways to tackle huge externality issues to effectively achieve our common targets. So development agencies are one of the key actors who can play a catalytic role in finding development and climate change nexus in mobilizing finance. So we may have seen waning of the global leadership and multilateralism in recent years, but pandemic and increase of the extreme weather events are the wake-up calls. And the international community should work together to contain a pandemic and address global issues with the recognition that these crises cannot be solved by a single country. Thank you very much.
Well, I have to start by saying a lot of fantastic work has been done globally to fight the pandemic, but there's no question that we can be doing better. The problem is that, and we're seeing this in regards to health, trade, and even security, is that in an increasingly competitive geopolitical arena, it's very tempting to take a me first approach, especially when you're under scrutiny from constituents who are we're struggling in so many ways. So the problem, and again, vaccines is such a good example of this, is that this me first approach has such a pernicious impact on the wider global community, and you actually end up you and the whole global community end up less safe with more COVID-19 variants, for example. So I think there's definitely an argument to be made for a truly global response to tackling the pandemic and its aftershocks. We need to cooperate to get 70% of the world vaccinated by July. We need to cooperate if we're going to tackle other big issues like debt and climate. Because like I said earlier, we've seen what happens when we don't equitably respond to a crisis. And if we fail, we're planting the seeds for much more expensive and serious crises in the future.